What is up, YouTube? Back in the garage once again. I feel like every time I do a video, the bike is either more stripped down or more put together. I guess that's how this goes. I didn't like the glitter gold in the fender. I talked about that. So that's at the shop right now, getting switched over to match the black. I'm only going to give you that little corner of the tank because there's a whole video on the tank. It's all powder coat, no paint, no filler, no anything. Just a lot of manual labor, grinding, sanding, prepping, and all powder. That's what I wanted to do, is make a powder queen and show you guys what I can do with powder coated stuff. It's not just, you know, your standard colors anymore. It's come a long way. Anyways, front head's off, had to fix a stud, got that solidified, so that's good. Just waiting to put the front cylinder back on. I don't want to mess with that right now. What I do want to do is start working on the rest of the motor, which involves, one, crank seal has to go in. That's probably not going to go in until I start getting around to the primary. But we have a naked transmission chest, so we are going to put a transmission in here. I think that's going to be what we're the end of tonight, because it's late and been working way more hours than I need to, and I want to be spending a bunch of hours on this, slapping everything back together. Fenders at the shop, waiting on the second coat. That'll come back, and then I can start solidifying the rear end. Once the rear end's done, I'll turn the frame sideways, put the forks that are rebuilt and ready to go back on. Wheel is done, ready to go. The rest of that should start slapping together pretty quick. I got the oil tank and all of those parts are coated in boxes. And then I just finished up the rockers. These are wet. They got degreaser fluid and cleaning stuff on them still, but rockers are done, so we're going to reload the rocker boxes. Other than that, I'm going to throw you guys on the tripod. On that side of the bike, we'll go through the transmission. I do not have to do a full rebuild. If you want to see the transmission rebuild / disassemble, inspect, and put back together, go back. I think it's in this playlist. If not, I do have a video, I think 2 or 3, on ironhead transmissions. So this is strictly going to be a loaded transmission install into the case. I didn't have to tweak or change or shim anything because all of this was working on this bike. I didn't have to shim the shift forks or anything either because all of this was working. If you are starting from scratch and buying a bunch of parts and swap meets and everything else, 1, make sure the trapdoor lines up proper. 2, make sure the trapdoor and the case are flat. If it's cocked at all, or you go to tighten a bolt and you get a high spot or a low spot, it will pinch and bind up the gears. I didn't have to worry about that. This one was all working. So this is going to be a quick 4 bolts that hold the transmission in, a ton of little needle bearings that we got to grease up and slap in, and a washer. So that's where we're at on this. Let me turn you guys around and we will get rolling. Okay, don't mind the shrapnel of the broken taillight. That was a stupid mistake that I made the other night. But we're on the wrong side. Transmission has to go in through the primary side. Forgot that I never installed this bearing while the cases were apart. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of assembly lube and pound this in, or not pound it in, but a little bit of assembly lube on the inside of these needles. This is a brand new bearing. It is a closed bearing. We're going to lube that up like crazy. So there's that part. Run this around. Just make sure all of the needles are coated in oil before we go on to the reassembly component. And then I get to pound this back into the motor. Now, it is a relatively tight fit. Would have been way easier to do while I had everything apart. But can't win them all. This is a me mess up. Okay, right bearing. I'm just an idiot. When I pounded this out, I disassembled everything real quick. I broke the outer shield off of the bearing. I never pounded the actual inner race out. So on these needle bearings, here's another one I found in the bin. You got a bunch of floating needles. You got a sealed edge that the needle bearings ride in, like so. And then you have this little cap. The cap is barely pressed in. So what I did when I disassembled this was take a punch, pounded the outer shield out, and broke a bunch of the needle bearings out of here. I didn't plan on reusing the bearing anyway, which is why it's currently sitting the way it is. If you take a 5/8 socket and an extension, come around to the inside, you'll watch that race kind of get pressed out. Again, I would recommend doing this before you disassemble, blast, and coat the cases. I think, now in retrospect, hindsight's 20/20, right? What I did, I pounded that outer cage out because I wanted to keep this race in the case so I could blast it and not worry about it. We're past that. This race has to come out, then we'll pound the new bearing in. Here's that sleeve. So I was wrong. Bearing is the right size, but won't fit when you have the outer sleeve in there. Now we get to do the same thing in reverse. Using a dead blow right now, just super sloppy. And now we're a little bit closer. So we use that 5/8 again. That's going to press on the outer cage with a steel hammer. Actually, I'm going to turn this one around a little bit. So essentially I turn the socket around so I have a nice flatter edge on the outside. These are relatively fragile. And beat this back in until it's flush. There is no lip on the inside of this cage, so it will go all the way through. Like if I keep pounding on this, it will press all the way through the inside of the case. Give it one more quick tap. There we go. Now our cage bearing is back in. Come around to the other side. So this bearing right here. You do not want to stick it out past the case. It's lubed up, ready to go. Here's what we're looking at on the cam chest area region, or not cam chest, the transmission chest. The snap ring is already in up here, so the snap ring will seat in there. I've worked on a couple customer bikes where they then put the needle bearings in but forget this thrust washer. If this is not in there, the needle bearings will go through the end of this little C-clip. I don't know how well you guys are going to be able to see this from down here, but there's a notch right here. That C-clip's just a spring clip. That locks into the groove. If this washer is not in, your needle bearings will slide out that hole and ruin everything. So I'm going to put this in right now. If I remember correctly, this is the one that came out of here, but there are different sizes for that. And then we're going to grease up this section and drop in a fresh set of needle bearings into this. They're floating. There's a million of them. You can do 2, 3 at a time, but you got to load this up until you have a full set of needle bearings all the way around this. There should not be a ton of slop in between them. So when I start on that, we'll try and get you a closer view of that. And then shifter shaft is going to have to go through here. I already have a new seal in there, so I'm going to lube that up on the other side. There's a brass bushing on the shifter shaft here, which, again, everything on this was working, so I didn't go crazy. I didn't redo it. You can't really tell it's brass because it's dark in here. But on the other side of this, there's a rubber seal. That is all lubed up and ready to go. Then, over on this side, sorry, got too much crap everywhere. Here's our transmission. Like I said, fully reloaded. Everything else is working. Got all the shims and all the spacers on here. The tang for the thrust washer is still on because it's a stock bike. Don't need to worry about that one. And Speedo drive gear is all on. Everything on this is good to go. If you don't believe me, look back through this playlist or XLCH transmissions or transmission things. I don't know. I did a quick reassembly on this and XLCH transmission in 10 minutes. Did I shim it? No. Did I have to? No. But I've talked to several people, and even good buddies of mine, that get really freaked out about ripping apart all the gears, and they seem overly complicated. Not too bad. I slapped together a quick video, just how to assemble a transmission. Nothing in terms of the details or setting up a transmission, but needle bearings, main shaft will ride on the needle bearings here. That's what we got to load up into the case here. Countershaft is fixed into the fixed bearing cage. So let me grab a bunch of grease and lube these up. We'll load the bearings in, and then we'll come back to the transmission. Well, that took forever. Here's the new rollers. 57 to 90. So, old Sporties, they didn't really change all that much. I like to keep the old ones when I still have them, though, because I have had a couple sets of these that were a little bit messed up right out of the box. Not messed up in the sense of they were broken or deformed or anything, but sizing-wise, there was definitely a difference. So what I'm going to do here, and this might be a little weird in the sense of doing it this way, I dropped all the needles into the case. Why do I do that? Well, I need to constantly, I'm going to do my best to get this on camera. I got a finger full of grease. Well, let's try and do this through the camera. So again, washer first. You need this spacer washer. This is going to go in, so we're just going to give a little bit of grease on here. I'm not going to go too crazy on this, but this will hold this against the C-clip. Now, I'm going to glob this up like crazy around the race. Like so. And with my greasy finger, I'm going to grab a couple of these at a time. 2, 3 is about the most you want. But these get pressed right back into this race. So we got 2 at the bottom here. 3, 4, 7, 8, 9. Maybe it's better if I put you off to the side a little bit. So we've got 9 in there. Just keep grabbing them. Slowly just kind of filling up this cage. There's 10. I'm using a greasy hand here because the grease helps pick up these little needles too. And you want them to go in straight. They're going to try and walk and shift and move on you. It's expected. 2 at a time is comfortable. Anything more than that, you can grab 4 of them, but it's hard to get them to line up proper once you get past that point. So I usually try and roll this around. The grease is going to hold it in place. You're just basically filling up the roll. So the more you get in, the more you can roll it around. If I remember correctly, they do sell oversized ones. I don't have machining equipment, so I'm kind of limited. If I do put the main shaft back in or put this trans back in and the main shaft has a ton of walk or play in it, then this race will need to get remachined or replaced with a bigger one. 2 left here. I already lost count. I don't remember. 23, 24 sounds familiar. I can actually give you guys a count on this too. But here's our last one. So hopefully you guys can see this in the light. We've got a web of bearing needles or rollers. And then they got one more right up here in this top corner. Now, if this does not fit in here snug and round, stop. Okay, you do not want any tension. You do not want like that, actually. As a matter of fact, if I have this and put pressure on this, the bearings roll. If I put that last bearing in, this might actually be one of those shitty V-twin ones where these bearings are not the correct size. So I do have all of the stock ones still that I might actually go back to if I can't get this to work proper. I don't know if there's crap in there or what, but these should all fit and spin free. So right now, no, that does not work. Let me grab a light. Okay, before I go any further, I don't know how well you can see this or if it helps or hurts having that towel on the backside. But if you look at this, I know I got a ton of grease here on the outside. Let me try and clean this up a hair. But if you look, this roller right here, try and move the light a little bit, does not sit all the way down in this cage. So if I put a nail in between this and try and rotate these bearings, it won't work. If I pull one bearing, see how free and easy that spins? That's what you're looking for. If that does not happen, do not run the new rollers. I don't care that they're brand new parts. I don't care what that does. But right there, you can see that this needle right there is sitting higher than the rest. I don't know if the light's helping or hurting here. Maybe that's a little bit better. See that one gap right here in between the rollers? These rollers do not fit in this race. Cool. We get to start all over. Yank them out. And that's not a washer issue, that is a bearing fitment issue. So I'm going to throw the washer back in, clean up the bearings on the bottom of the case. Giant mess I just made. Yank these, throw them right back in the junk bag, and save them. It might be an oversized kit. Alright, so this is the stock set of rollers that I pulled out of the motor. Just had them sitting in this wood pallet of miscellaneous oddball parts. So, kind of cleaned these up a little bit. I know they're sitting on a bunch of dirt, but that's okay. I'm going to put this on a fresh towel, re-wipe them down, and then we'll slap them back in the motor, see how those fit. I don't know if this is any better or worse, but we're going to give this a shot. So I just got all the bearings cleaned up here, so we're going to come around to the outside and do the same thing. 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Fits. The last set of bearings I got, diameter-wise, when I mic'd these, they were fine. See how this actually spins now? And there's no gaps all the way around. I know I have one mismatched one. I honestly don't know if I had a full set of these bearings when I did all of this, but this spins around nice and free, no resistance. If I grab the rollers, it turns, it works. We're going to run with that. I don't like knocking people. However, these two bags are exactly the same kit. This is the trans rollers that I had in the box, and I didn't run them because the length of the actual rollers was just a tiny, like, I don't even know. I'm not a machinist, so I don't know the thous, but it was barely longer than the old ones. I used the stock ones last time because they were longer than what I needed. This box that I just got last week, or bag, came with a bunch of brand new rollers. These are oversized based on the fitment. These are bigger than these. So I don't like knocking people. I'm not holding V-Twin accountable. I know they're made in Taiwan. They're paying the same price to get whatever parts they order. Same part number, same everything else. But check your stuff. Don't just assume that it's brand new and it's going to work, because parts quality these days is crap. I'm going to throw both of these back in the extra bin of miscellaneous extra stuff that I buy, so I have them. In this case, if I need one needle bearing, I'm going to take the one that's got the right diameter that allows this to spin free. You do not want resistance here. Resistance here will burn up your main shaft, and that gets really, really expensive. So that's good. I'm going to glob up a little bit more grease on this, just on the inside. We're not ready to throw the trans in yet, because we still need to put the shifter in and lube up the seal on the outside. So while I got a greasy finger, I'll come around to the other side. This is that same bearing area. Over lube this. I know I put some oil on this seal, but we're going to put some actual grease on there when we drop the shifter in. And then I'm going to put some lube on the shifter shaft support while we're at it. And we'll throw the shifter in first. We're going to go backside on this. A little bit there, a little bit there. I do still have a grease fitting to adjust and add more to this later. But just like that. Lubed up. Bearings loaded. Now, assembly-wise, the only thing left, shifter shaft's going to go through here, and I'll show you guys how to line that up. So let me do this. I think we're going to run in, eat some dinner, then come back out and button up this trans. Yeah, we'll throw the shifter shaft in first. So everything that I have right now came out of the bike originally. The shaft's not in the best of shape, but I'd rather run stuff that I know is in a bike that ran than replace it with brand new repop stuff, because it's kind of hit or miss. So I threw some grease in the shifter shaft, grease on the shaft itself. I do have a couple spacers here, that washer that's kind of floating. Normally I'd dry assemble all of this. There's one more. So this had 2 shims on the inner shifter shaft. Normally I would dry assemble all of this first. In this case, like I said, I did have this bike running. It did shift through the gears okay. I didn't actually ride it, so I don't know how perfect it is. But I'm going to run this pretty much the exact way that I took it apart. So I'm keeping the 2 shims there. And I will then, like I said, run in, eat some dinner. Then all we got to do is come out now, drop the transmission back in here, line up the shifter rod, so that's got to get pressed into the case, through the trans on the trapdoor, and then we got 4 bolts to button up this transmission. Well, you know you got a good woman when you are rushing to run back inside and eat dinner that she's been cooking for the last couple hours, and she says, how much more time do you need out there if you're going back out after dinner? And I say, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes-ish, which usually is never 15 to 20 minutes. And she says, fine, go back out in the garage, don't come in until you're done. Well, now we get to put the trans back together. So, let me turn you guys around one more time, like so. And I honestly don't know the best place to put you for this, so maybe I'll put you right here for now. What we need to worry about on the transmission itself. Here's the trans, like I said, fully loaded. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to drop some assembly lube on these gears, and then we're going to jam this in. So let me shift the bike over a bit so I have a little bit more bench top room. Oh, everything's starting to get heavy. That's enough space. Nice clean workbench, if you will. I'm a purist about cleanliness. So there's that. Let me throw some oil on these gears. We'll be right back in a second. Last of the assembly lube getting used right now. Last of this bottle at least. It's lived a good life. 2 Fords, a couple ironheads, an Evo, a Honda. People blow through this stuff like crazy. I'm going to say that as I'm excessively pouring more than I ever would onto all of these different things. And it is a transmission. These gears all mesh and go together. Don't forget your main shaft and the end of the counter shaft. Like I said, I'm killing off the bottle. Normally I wouldn't do it this way. And we'll put some on the shifter shaft too. But there we have it. That's the end of this bottle. One bottle of assembly lube has done 4 motors. Now, I'm going to spin this. Like I said, I've already gone through this. Ugh, just a little shy. A little less than what I actually wanted. I wanted a little more in between the gears here. Couple things you got to think about when you're going through and putting these together. You want to lube up the main shaft area where it's going to go into the greased bearings that are on the inside. Countershaft, we're going to re-lube that one up with a little bit of excess. This one I actually think is a little bit thicker and tackier, so I'm going to really load up these gears just for the first start. Don't forget your speedo drive and your speedo gear as well. So there's that. I'll run this around. Try and get a nice gear mesh. This is way more than I usually do. Normally I like running my fingers over this and not making a big oily mess, but it is what it is. And this stuff being as thick and tacky as it is, kind of gives you your gear pattern in terms of where, if you spin them quickly, you can see the strings of oil across the gears there. Like I said, I've bench tested this, I've gone through all of this. Everything on here was working pretty well. Only other part, don't forget your speedo drive gear. Maybe we'll go back to another brand after this, try another one, see if it makes any difference. I don't think it will, but putting a little lube in the cases. So loaded up the lower countershaft bearing, loaded up the speedo drive gear. I'm going to spin that around a couple times, make sure that's nice and coated. I don't know if you can see that. Speedo drive's down here, and then a little bit in the shifter shaft, just to make it a little bit easier on me for install. Now, this is the shifter shaft. You want this to sit at a 90-degree angle. Hopefully that shows up on camera, but this is lined up with that shifter shaft hole right now, because when we load this trapdoor in, and by trapdoor I mean the entire transmission, when this gets loaded in, the shifter shaft is going to drop in to this hole right here on the ratchet gear. So shifter shaft's going to sit into this, the ball is going to lock in here, the shifter shaft is going to go in that front hole. And make sure you're in neutral. We should be good to go here. Now, you got to be kind of careful here, because if you catch the bearings and it doesn't seat proper, or you don't mesh up on the gear, then you run into all sorts of bigger issues down the line. So 3 shafts. You got to worry about this lining up in the shifter shaft hole, main shaft going through the bearings, and then you have your actual shifter itself to line up on these detents. So at this point, once the main shaft's kind of through, shifter shaft is in on this side. I can't give you 2 angles, so take my word for it. I will give you the commentary. We want the shifter shaft to go into that groove first, which I think I actually just pushed it out of there. The problem is when you start messing around and going in and out with this, all that grease you put on those main shaft bearings, it might try to stick to the rollers and you'll drop a bunch of rollers. Like right now, I got one flip-free roller that came out. So this is going to go right back into the case. Shifter shaft is lined up now. The other option you have is trying to line the shifter shaft up first. So I pull it out from seated a little bit, which is where I'm at right now. And then if you put a little bit of pressure on that, you can kind of guide that into the case. Do make sure you're not pushing any of the needle bearings back out like I just did again. God dang it. Should not be that difficult. But if you use a good amount of grease on the shifter shaft, it'll kind of hold that spot right exactly where it's at. We'll try this again. Just like that. So now we're through on the main shaft. I didn't lose any bearings on the back side of this, so that's good. shifter shaft, if you grab the shaft that runs through over here, it's got a little keyway there, but if I grab this and try and spin it, I can't rotate it at all. It's got a little bit of play in it, which is fine, but I cannot rotate that, which means it is engaged on the shifter shaft on the ratchet gear of the transmission. And now we're kind of lined up on the dowel pins here. So now what I'm going to do is take a dead blow, give a couple little love taps here. I'm not going to beat the crap out of it or anything. But we do want this to line up on the dowels. So we got one dowel down here, one more up here. And I'll hit this metal part here. You don't want to really hit the edges or the corners all that much. And the dowel fins should fit pretty tight on here. Not tight, but these trapdoors are machined with the case. I think this motor was rebuilt, so it might have been tweaked and cleaned up. And basically, double check that fitment before, especially if you're doing a swap meet build. Make sure you get a trapdoor that actually lines up on the case. Sometimes you got to ream these out a little bit. They sell oversized dowel pins and things like that, or they will need to get remachined just to make sure that the mating surfaces all line up proper. But that is pretty much seated. Dowel pins are all the way in. Spin your main shaft, make sure everything feels good here. I can't shift it until I put a shifter on it. But if this is spinning free with no resistance, you're typically in pretty good luck. Make sure this isn't binding. If I push in and out on this, there's a tiny bit of drag, or not drag, but there is end play here. It's hard to see from your angle, but there is a bit of play here. I'm okay with that. And then we're going to continuously check, feel what this is like right now without any bolts in. When I start threading in 1, 2, 3, 4 bolts, when we put the 4 bolts back in, I'm going to constantly keep a feel on what this main shaft feels like. If it gets tight at any of these 4 bolts, then we have an issue and we might have to shim the trapdoor or shim something on the inside of this motor. Hardware for the trapdoor. Nothing fancy whatsoever. You have 4 5/16 coarse thread bolts. They are about 1 inch long. And what I like to do is run a couple washers if you can. You don't always need them. I honestly don't remember if they came with washers from the factory, but you're screwing into aluminum. If I can get these to fit proper, I'll use them with the washer. The only issue you run into is a lot of times they've been torqued so many times, kind of like I'm looking at right now, where they actually wear into the case. So I'm going to throw some red Loctite on these threads, and then we will put these 4 bolts in, make sure everything threads in nice and easy. I re-tapped everything on the case, so I shouldn't have any issues on that side, but I'm going to grab some red Loctite, and then we'll crank this in. I don't remember where I put my big thing of my usual red Loctite, so now we're going to go ahead and use the Permatex brand. I really like the actual Loctite brand much more, but beggars can't be choosers, and I need to get this done before I go into dinner. So 4 bolts is all that holds your entire transmission in. It's kind of crazy to me. And then I'm not going crazy with this yet, but we are going to use this to snug them up a little bit, like so. Now we're going to do a torque, final torque. So we need a ratchet, and where did I put my extension / hammer tool? There we go. Again, double check the main shaft, because now the bolts are seated. This still spins really nicely. Still good there. Still good there. Tight there. Ooh, I'm not really happy with that thread, actually. Good with that one. Let's try this real quick. We chased all of these threads and they were fine. There's no binding or cross threading or anything to worry about like that, but the only concern I have is if I am actually running a washer here, it's not getting deep enough into the threads. So, let's see what happens if we ditch the upper washers. Oh, shite. Well, bottom two are good. I'm going to put thread helicoils in here on the upper two because that's the right thing to do. They're grabbing, they're snugging up, but they're not snugging up good enough to me to be comfortable sending this down the road. So this is no longer going to be a one-day project. Now I get to pull this, redo everything, slap it back together, re-helicoil these two, and then slap it back together. Kind of a pain, but I want to make sure everything's set up right. Don't skimp out on that. If you're like tightening it down and it's like, oh, well, it seems like it's kind of tight. Oh, yeah, it seems like it's going to grab. If you're in doubt at all, fix it. It's only going to open up a bigger can of worms down the road. So now I'm at a pause point once again, but everything feels good. So I'm not worried about that. This is a quick fix, in my opinion. We'll film that and show you why it's worth fixing that now instead of putting it off and hoping for the best. Thanks for watching. Have a good one. That's the end of this video. I'll make a new one on specifically drilling and helicoiling the transmission bolts. Also would have been way better to do this outside of the bike, but I'm racing the clock and don't really have a lot of time for all of these headaches. Catch you on the next one.